My topic is wholeness and ecology, and I speak to you on this topic from the point of view of my experience as a physician and as a student of the New Testament, as a scholar of the New Testament, if I may say so. Let's begin with our first text in the book of Genesis, from the creation story. We read that God said, "Let the waters bring forth swarms of living creatures, and let birds fly above the earth across the dome of the sky." So God created the great sea monsters and every living creature that moves of every kind, with which the waters swarm, and every winged bird of every kind. And God saw that it was good. Now, where are we in the story here? Which day of creation is this? This is the fifth day of creation, and this is the first time that God will speak to what He has created. And this is what He says. "And God blessed them, saying, Be fruitful and multiply, and fill the waters in the seas, and let birds multiply on the earth." So, God's first blessing, this is the first time that God speaks, and God speaks in the language of blessing. And the audience, the recipients of God's blessing, is non-human creation. And this will set up a pattern. There will be more blessings, but we need to start where it begins. So there is human creation. On the sixth day of creation, we read this: "God blessed them, and God said to them, Be fruitful and multiply, and fill the earth and subdue it, and have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the air, and over every living thing that moves upon the earth." Now, so there is a blessing on the fifth day of creation, on non-human creation. There is a similarly worded blessing on human creation, on the sixth day of creation. But what's the ecological implications of this? The ecological implications of this, obviously, is that there is something for non-human creation in the creation story, not only for human creation. In some ways, human creation and non-human creation inhabit the same space of blessing, the same sort of sphere of blessing that God has set up. And then, of course, on the seventh day, we read this: "Then God blessed the seventh day and sanctified it, because in it He rested from all His work which God had created and made." Fifth day of creation, a blessing on non-human creation. Sixth day of creation, a blessing on human creation. Seventh day, a blessing on all creation. But this cascade of blessings begins with God's blessing on non-human creation. And the ecological and also ethical implications of this can hardly be exaggerated. So, summarizing or extracting a few points here, we can say that with God's blessing on non-human creation, God has given non-human creation a bill of rights. It isn't, that is the implication of being under God's blessing. God's blessing is a blessing in perpetuity. It is a blessing that has not been rescinded, as we will find confirmation for in other texts that I will get to later. And then there is also, with the notion of human dominion, there is not a mandate for humans to exploit or to have a predatory relationship to the earth and to non-human creation. There is, in fact, a responsibility resting on humans. God and non-human creation has rightful expectations of human beings. So that's what we can get from the creation story in just very rudimentary ways, but we have done not a little by emphasizing this, because it has often been overlooked. In my own faith community, we have a strong tradition to emphasize God's blessing on the seventh day, but much less so emphasizing God's blessing on the fifth day of creation, and that is very much, or also part of the biblical perspective. So, I want to read a statement from Catherine Green McCreight, who writes in a comment on the seventh day in a wonderful book called The Reciprocity of Faithfulness. It's a book on the Ten Commandments. She says, that if creation is loosed from the narrative framework of the Bible, this is what we're talking about here, the narrative framework of the Bible, we are left with absolutely no warrants to care for the created order. This is largely why we are in the environmental crisis in which we find ourselves. In public discourse, creation has in fact been loosed from its biblical narrative framework. The only warrant that the secular world gives us to care for the environment is a thinly veiled version of self-concern. Our children will suffer unless we change our habits. I want to pause there. I haven't finished reading the statement. I want to pause to say, what is she saying? She's saying that the current concerns in the environment is not a concern so much for the environment as it is a concern for human beings, the consequences to us. But that is not how the Bible thinks about that subject. It doesn't think in terms of consequentialist ethics, you might say. It thinks in terms of an ethics of rights or of blessing. So here I'm completing the statement, rights versus consequences here. Divorcing creation from redemption leaves us alone in the world with our own reflection as our only companion. The message of ecologists, here is the punchline, the message of ecologists is far more powerful when framed in terms of the biblical narrative. The waters we pollute and the land we poison were created by the one who made, reconciles, and redeems us. And just to sort of reinforce the point of the blessing in the creation story, these are elements that God had intended to bless so that the other sides of creation, non-human creation, also could flourish. So,
can you set up a framework on ecology? What's your view, and so I can understand?
Well, ecology means the whole of creation. Everything exists. It's the home of within which we all live. So it compasses all of creation, non-human creation, the earth. Everything is included in the notion of ecology. So, yeah. So and in the Bible it begins, of course, God creates day 1, day 2, day 3. You see, the earth, the environment, the ecosystem, whatever, is coming into existence, and everything God creates, God says it was good. That's its very conspicuous feature. There is divine intent. There is actualization. God said it was so. And then there is also an assessment, an evaluative statement. It was good, which is also very important. And then when God does speak to creation, he speaks to non-human creation first and endows non-human creation, as it were, with a Bill of Rights, with the right to flourish. So thank you for that comment. Now I wish to broaden this perspective, or to anchor it somewhat in the Sabbath, because the Sabbatarian structure of life in the Old Testament is so conspicuous that we would be very much amiss if we did not explore it. So the primary element in the Sabbatarian ideology, the Sabbatarian structure of life in the Old Testament, is of course the seventh-day Sabbath. And here, reading now from the Exodus account, the Ten Commandments, we see that the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. You shall not do any work. You, your son or your daughter, your male or female slave, your livestock, or the alien resident in your towns. Now this is a sweeping statement. It is very inclusive. It's you, it is your family, it is your male or female slave, meaning the most vulnerable people, meaning those who might just seem like they would need to work every day of the week. And there is even an inclusion of rest for livestock, for animals, and then also for the resident alien. So there is an inclusivity to this Sabbath perspective here. Now, what is the ecological working principle of the Sabbath? If you look at this text, now that you have interacted with me, let me return the favor. What is the ecological working principle of the Sabbath?
Allowing the livestock to rest?
Well, there is rest, of course. There is what? There is cessation. Cessation of activity. There is no, on all the other days of the week, we intervene in our environment, we produce, we do things. But on the seventh day, there is cessation of activity. And that is also the language of the initial or the original Sabbath text in Genesis 2, that God ceased. Well, it says, we often translate it, God rested, but God ceased would have been a better translation. And it would be the translation to prefer when you read these texts ecologically, because cessation is really what is needed to put a stop to activity. Now, I'm rushing over this, but you can interrupt whenever you see a reason to do so. So, the first Sabbath satellite in the Old Testament is the sabbatical year, talked about in Exodus and in Leviticus. I will just read one text. For 6 years you shall sow your land and gather in its yield, but the 7th year you shall let it rest and lie fallow. So what is happening here? What does the sabbatical year mandate? It mandates cessation. It mandates what? Rest for the land. Rest for the land. Now, other beneficiaries are also included in the rest for in what is called the land Sabbath. There is there is a privileging of people who are not landowners, that they will be harvesting whatever grows during the sabbatical year. And there is also an explicit mention of wild animals, that they get in some ways to have a little more be a little more sort of let loose. But the primary beneficiary is the land. Now, is that an ecological configuration? Well, what else would it be? That there is a concern for the well-being of the land, that the land also, nature also needs rest, that nature is a finite resource, and we need to respect its finitude, as it were. And then, of course, there is the Jubilee, which is a multiple of Sabbaths, a series of 7 sabbatical years. In the 50th year, here we read, and you shall hallow the 50th year, and you shall proclaim liberty throughout the land to all its inhabitants. It shall be a jubilee for you. You shall return every one of you to your property, and every one of you to your family. Now, this is an amazing idea, and has been treated as a, how in the world could anyone conceive that one could have a what should we call it, a socio-economic system like this. What does it mean? It means that people might lose their property during those 50 years. And at the end of the 50 years, what happens if you lost your property? You get it back. There is a socio-economic reset, And so, if you gain property, if you are among the winners, and you took over land that somebody else had, what then? In the Jubilee, you have to give it up. So, what does it mean? It means that there is a ceiling on acquisition of property. It means that there is a safety net for the losers. It means that there is a kind of structured remedy for growing disparity between the very rich and the poor. You see that? Can you see that? That's very conspicuous here.
Is that still practiced now in the East? And the other question is, at what point is the calculation start? What's the datum, the reference datum for the calculation?
The second question I cannot answer. I don't know. The first question I can answer. I know. It isn't practiced. It probably never was practiced. This is an idea, this is an ideology in the Bible, and we have no proof that it was ever practiced. We do have proof, we do have evidence that the sabbatical year was meant to be taken seriously, because when the Israelites go into captivity in Babylon, it is said that the duration of captivity would be calculated according to the number of sabbatical years that had not been observed. 70 of them, meaning that there would be captivity for 490 years. You find that in Jeremiah and the book of Chronicles. So there is, other sources saying that God was serious about providing rest for the land, and is in fact keeping his promise to the land, even though the landholders do not keep the promise. Well, here is the other or the sort of punchline on the Jubilee. The land shall not be sold in perpetuity, for the land is mine. With me you are but aliens and tenants. So let's put this in contemporary economic categories. Does the Bible think in terms of a capitalist economy where you and I, individuals, own the land? Or does it think in terms of a socialist, collectivist, communist notion of ownership where the state or we own the land? So what is it? Is it capitalism or is it communism? It is not capitalism, because you don't own the land. It's very explicitly not a capitalist notion where private ownership of land is seen as the sort of what should I say, the backbone of a capitalist economy. The land shall not be sold in perpetuity, for the land is mine. For the land is mine. And you are what? You are aliens and tenants. Well, what a wonderful text. At one point I was in a meeting with some people, and we were discussing which book of the Bible we could do without. If we were to take out one book of the Bible, which would it be? Well, the Leviticus was a candidate to be omitted, but let's not do it because there is stuff of value here, and certainly as an ecological text, Leviticus could really make a very strong comeback as a significant ecological text in the Bible today. I want to summarize what we have seen with respect to the Sabbath. The ecological working principle of the Sabbath is cessation. We did that. I think you will agree with me that has ecological ramifications. The Sabbath year makes manifest the ecological intent of the Sabbath by mandating rest for the land. So the ideology of the Sabbath is in place. It is extended. It is applied in the notion of the Sabbath year. So even if we might not do Sabbath years precisely, we will still try to find ways to make that ideology come to fruition. And then the Jubilee. The Jubilee provides economic amnesty, and this is a very complicated sentence, but I have worked on it hard, and I would like you to ponder its implications. The Jubilee provides economic amnesty while also ensuring permanently decentralized ownership of the land, or the land proprietors. Permanently decentralized ownership of the land, a key component of contemporary ecological thinking. See, what is one of the problems in land management today? Well, it is that more and more of the land owned by fewer and fewer people. Land ownership, more and more tending to be a corporate thing. So there is a huge distance between the ones who own the land and the ones who work the land. See, the owner, and there is a disconnect there. And contemporary ecologists are very much yearning for a return to a biblical notion where the land ownership is permanently decentralized. Do you follow me here? This is a very important point. See, when land is reduced to a commodity, as it is today, we call it real estate, and is seen as a sort of, there is a monetary value to it that just goes, that is very much, what should I say, can be tweaked and speculated on. That is very, very different from the way the biblical economic idea about land is. Permanently decentralized ownership of the land. We need to go on. Just a comment here on how the Bible thinks. The Bible isn't just commanding. It isn't just saying, this is what God says, God said it, I believe it, that's all there is to it. Here is what Patrick Miller says about the character of law in ancient Israel. One of the primary features of Israelite law, one that appears first in the Ten Commandments, he says, is the presence of motivation clauses that serve as a mode of divine persuasion on the one hand, and the rationality of the commandments on the other. So what is it? That God is, the kind of discourse we have today. What would be the best way of doing it? How should we do it? What is the best solution? The underlying thought in the Bible is that it is presenting to us good ideas and is asking for us to come on board, to good ideas and sustainable ways of living. We're shifting gears. I'm not sure how we're doing for time. Can you give me a clue? I forgot to look at my watch. But we're shifting gears now to from the Bible, and we will return to the Bible again, but I want to explore a couple of ideological and historical roots of the ecology crisis. So I have 4 points. The first one is the Platonic influence on Christianity. The second one is a sort of looks strange, but let me mention it as this: Francis Bacon and the ideology of domination. We will do these in a little more detail, so we will return to them. The third one is the eclipse of creation in theology. And the fourth one is that there is a notion of production rather than plenitude as the measure of success in industrial society. So how do we do these four? Let's start with Plato. So Plato is the most influential philosopher of all time. He is also one of the best writers of all time. He is one of the few philosophers who writes literature and who is equally respected and recognized among people who just read books for literary reasons and not just for philosophy. So Plato is the sort of foundational figure here. Plato's books are written as dialogues. They are conversations where the main interlocutor is Socrates, who was Plato's teacher. Socrates did not write books. We know what Socrates thinks through Plato, and maybe we don't know what Socrates thinks. Maybe we only know what Plato thought, because who knows? He represents Socrates in a certain way. So here is a dialogue. This is from a book or where Socrates describes the death of where Plato describes the death of Socrates, and it's quite a wonderful book to read it. The Last Days of Socrates is one of the titles of this book. It's published under many titles. Socrates, here is what he says: "Do we believe that there is such a thing as death?" Simmias, one of his students: "To be sure." Socrates: "And is this anything but the separation of soul and body? And being dead, is the attainment of this separation when the soul exists in herself and is parted from the body, and the body is parted from the soul? Is that death?" Simmias: "Exactly that, and nothing else." So what is he saying? What is the implications here? And this is the only text I'll give you from Plato. The implications is what? The implications is that life can go on without a body. That you really do not need the material world to exist. The material world, in fact, is really something to deplore. It would be better without it. Death is not just the separation of the soul from the body in Socrates' thought or in Plato's thought. Death is also the liberation of the soul from the body. It is the liberation of the immaterial component of life from the material. See, so death is really bad or good? Bad or good? Death is good. Death is not a problem in Plato's thought. Death is not a problem to Socrates. When he walks around there and finally drinks the hemlock, he jokes with his students. You know, he is very much at ease. You know, he sends the women away because there is not much for women in Plato or Socrates. It's a very misogynistic or whatever way of looking at things. Very much a contrast, by the way, to Jesus, who agonizes when he dies, and lo and behold, there are lots of women there in the stories as a contrast to these two very influential figures. So, but this is the bottom line of Plato, that the material world is not something we should worry much about. We should worry about the immaterial world. We should worry about the soul. Now, this plays into Christianity, and I'm leaving out, I will just mention the transition point. The transition point for Plato into Christianity happens in a city in Egypt, the most influential city in educational terms in the ancient world. Now, what is your education capital in America today or in the world today? How about Boston? How about Harvard University? How about Massachusetts Institute of Technology? Where would those institutions have been in the ancient world? They would have been in Alexandria in Egypt. You know, the world was Hellenized. You know, there is Alexander the Great, and then there is all these consequences of that, and there is a wonderful city on the shore of the Mediterranean in Egypt, Alexandria, that becomes for several centuries the center of influence in the ancient world. In that city, there is a contemporary of Jesus and Paul. His name is Philo. Philo reads the Bible through the eyes of Plato. He reads the Bible as though there is in the Bible too a disparagement of the material world. And then a few hundred years later, there is Origen of Alexandria. Origen is a Christian. I like him. He is a nice person. He is a very genuine in his piety, and otherwise he's a very learned man. Many of you have not heard of Origen, but Origen is the most influential Christian thinker after the Bible and until Augustine. So until Augustine in the 5th century, Origen is the most influential. Origen is still today the most influential thinker in Eastern Christianity, among Eastern Orthodox thinkers. Here is Origen. Listen to what he says. God therefore made the present world and bound the soul to the body as punishment. Bodies exist as what? Punishment. Not as a part of God's original intent. The body, is it good or bad? The body isn't very good here. And then what's the end game in Origen? For if all things can exist without bodies, doubtless bodily substance will cease to exist when there is no longer use for it. This is, this is how the leading Christian thinker thinks in terms of the body, the material world, a couple of centuries after the time of Jesus. And this has had a huge influence on Christianity and on Christian ideology. Peter Brown is probably the foremost expert on in the sort of transition period between the ancient world and the Middle Ages. He has written a wonderful book called The Body and Society, and this is what he says. When in the course of the late 5th and 6th centuries, profound changes sapped the political and economic structure of the cities of the Mediterranean, the Christian notions we have just described came to the fore. The notions he has described, I have described to you in a very rudimentary way. Disparagement of the body, interest in the soul, disparagement of the present life in the present world, interest in the hereafter, that's the paradigm. And here is what is coming. They ratified a very different sense of the community and of the human person within it from that current in the age of Marcus Aurelius. Marcus Aurelius, a Roman emperor in the late 2nd century, what does he say? He says times were better then because there was more appreciation for the body and life in this world than what came to exist in Christianity. They made plain what Jacques Le Goff has described in a memorable phrase as la déroute du corporel, that is to say, the definitive rout of the body. The rout of the body. These two guys, Jacques Le Goff is a great medievalist, and here is Peter Brown quoting him as an authority, that marked the end of the ancient world and the beginning of the Middle Ages. So what does Christianity bring to the table? It brings to the table disinterest in the body, disinterest in the earth, in the material world. Let's go on. It comes to a head in some ways, in my view, in the Middle Ages, or with the Black Death, that devastating pandemic that came and went many times. They had bubonic plague many times in the ancient world. There is a case of bubonic plague today, by the way, reported in, I think, was it Yosemite or Yellowstone? One just today, I saw in the paper today. But in the course of 2 years, the equivalent of, if we were to translate it into contemporary terms, in the course of 2 years, if this had happened in America today, 100 million Americans would have died. Now that is, that packs punch, doesn't it? This happens at a time when the influence of Christianity is at its zenith. Christianity has not ever had a stronger hold on the people of Europe than it did during the time of the Black Death, and never have human beings found themselves more helpless, more at a loss to know what to do. So here is what Alexander Solzhenitsyn said about that in a speech he gave to graduating students at Harvard in 1978. The Middle Ages came to a natural end by exhaustion, having become an intolerable, despotic repression of man's physical nature in favor of the spiritual one. When I try to represent this, I put it up like this, that under the influence of Plato, let's blame Plato for it. Under the influence of Plato, as he is appropriated by the Christian civilization until the end of the Middle Ages, there is an era of neglect of the body, of the earth. There is a very abrupt transition point. The date 1543 is a somewhat arbitrary date, but it is it doesn't hang on nothing. That's the date when Copernicus publishes his book about the solar system, and it is the date when Andreas Vesalius publishes his book on anatomy, Fabrica, on the human body. Amazing books, both of these. The era of neglect ends. To replace it, we get, unfortunately, in many ways a better era, if I may say so. But we also get an era of domination that we owe to the person on the picture. That's Francis Bacon. And this happens. There are many moving parts here, and I will confuse you a little here. But there is also René Descartes, the French philosopher, who at this time, at this point of transition, revives the notion of dualism, the separation of the soul from the body. I knew that I was a substance, the whole essence and nature of which is to think, and that for its existence there is no need of any place, nor does it depend of any material thing. That is to say, the soul by which I am is entirely distinct from the body. Descartes is famous for what? What's his sentence? I think, therefore I am. And the thinking self, is the thinking self the brain? Is the Cartesian notion of the thinking self anchored in the brain, in the physical organ of the brain? Not at all. not at all. It is separate from the body. So there is then again, as we transition here, we go to a greater interest in the body, but we don't get rid of dualism. So now I will comment one more thing on that, but I just want to show you one slide. Gerhard von Rath is the most influential Old Testament theologian of the 20th century, and he says that creation theology was never meant to be at the center of the Old Testament or of the Bible. Our main thesis was that in genuinely Yahwistic belief, the doctrine of creation never attained to the stature of a relevant independent doctrine. What is he saying? He's saying that the meat, the interest in the Bible, is salvation of human beings, what they called salvation history. It isn't creation. The story of creation is an appendix. It was added afterwards. That's what he is saying. Is he right? Has that view been influential? Very much so. Is it correct? Not at all. And many Old Testament scholars today, from all denominations practically, are working hard to undo the damage of the idea that creation theology is kind of just an appendix. Well, let me quote, let's put back the idea or this representation of an era of neglect to an era of domination. And I will quote from Wendell Berry, who is a wonderful American. He's a farmer, he's a poet, he's a writer, he's a philosopher, and he has written a wonderful book that I read just the year I graduated from medical school. I read this book, and it has been a great companion for me for many years now. This is what he says. The separation of the soul from the body and from the world is no disease of the fringe, no aberration, but a fracture that runs through the mentality of religion like a geologic fault. And this is second sentence here. And this rift in the mentality of religion continues to characterize the modern mind, no matter how secular and worldly it becomes. That is to say, the way we conceptualize reality, even now that we have put the worst sort of excesses of the Middle Ages behind us, is still characterized by separation, by fractures. And so it isn't easy to extricate ourselves. If we were to configure wholeness now in a sort of remedial conception, we could listen to Wendell Berry once more and hear what he says here. A medical doctor uninterested in nutrition and agriculture, in the wholesomeness of mind and spirit, is as absurd as a farmer who is uninterested in health. Now you tell me, are medical students interested in farming and so on? Is that curriculum? Not really. There is, a disconnect there. Farmers, are they interested in health? Well, yes and no. Probably mostly no.
In Cuba it's different. In Cuba, the doctors, medical doctors, have to be spending.
So there are places. Yeah, well, and maybe we should learn something from Cuba. Let's not be condescending here. Wendell Berry again. Our fragmentation of this subject cannot be the cure because it is the disease. The body cannot be whole alone. Persons cannot be whole alone. It is wrong to think that bodily health is compatible with spiritual confusion or cultural disorder or with polluted air and water or impoverished soul. So, that's quite an amazing statement, isn't it? And he has worked very, very well and in some ways very effectively to bring his perspective to bear. I want to do a few specifics here, and this is another transition. World meat consumption is represented here. The highest meat consumer countries are the Western countries, including developed countries like Australia and New Zealand. They're similar. The US consumes more meat per capita than any other country in the world, but European countries are not far behind. The lowest meat consumers in the world are countries like Bangladesh, India. India is changing because there is a growing middle class in India now, so things are changing. But now, if I were to say that this slide represents, let's say that Bangladesh and India, they consume meat at an ecologically sustainable level. I'm introducing this topic as a topic relevant to ecology. These countries, the lowest consuming countries, they consume meat at an ecologically sustainable level. Then you get an idea of the task that we have in Western countries to bring meat consumption to such a, to a level that is ecologically sustainable. Now, here is another trend. The trend of meat consumption is going up. The trend of how meat is produced has changed dramatically over the past 30 years. So what is my slide here showing you? My slide is showing you that in 1979 there were 650,000 units, 650,000 farms producing meat, pork, raising pigs for pork. How many today? What's the number now? 65,000. Are they producing? So people stopped eating pork. Suddenly there was a huge decline in pork consumption. Isn't that how you should interpret this? You shouldn't. You should interpret it that pork consumption is increasing, but the number of entities producing it is decreasing dramatically. We have moved from the era of family farming to factory farming. So what does that have to do with ecology? It has a lot to do with ecology, because meat consumption is a huge ecological issue, and I want to now say that it is also a huge ethical issue. It is also an eco-theological issue, a concern for anyone who thinks about wholeness. Matthew Scully is a Republican who has worked with the second George Bush as one of his speechwriters, so this is a politically not tainted message that I am giving you. I want to sort of make that declaration. I would love to read many statements from Scully. Dominion, the power of man, the suffering of animals, and the call to mercy. He chronicles how these factory farms are, the crowding, the suffering, the deprivation of living out an animal's life cycle, the impossibility for an animal to flourish. Did God bless non-human creation? Did God intend non-human creation to flourish? Very much so. Here, Scully says, factory farming isn't just killing, it is negation. Negation here should be heard as the opposite of blessing. It is negation, a complete denial of the animals as a living being with his or her needs and nature. It is not the worst evil we can do, but it is the worst evil we can do to them, to non-human creation. It used to be that in my faith community, Adventist, that we would sort of prove our piety by abstaining from pork. We don't eat pork. This is a good idea. It's still relevant ecologically, but it is not a good enough thing to sort of brandish your piety by not eating pork. Today, defending the pig is piety. Not eating the pig is whatever. It doesn't count for much, because the pig is really one of the animals, one of the most abused animals you can think of in the era of factory farming. So I'm just throwing this out. Now there is another component here. How are we doing for time? Sorry to ask you about that again. We're fine. Okay, because in the era of factory farming, and this intersects then with human health a bit more, there is also a big concern about antibiotic use. And I will again do this very briefly, just in sort of bullet point form. Now, what is this slide intended to show? This is intended to show, this is a representation of antibiotic use in human medicine and in non-human medicine. Can you see that? So the tall column is livestock use, antibiotic use in non-human medicine. So what is the proportion? About 20% of antibiotics that are produced in the world today are used to treat human beings. 80% are used in non-human medicine, in animal medicine. And this is particularly the case in North America, because the biggest violator, the biggest ecological culprit when it comes to antibiotic use is definitely the United States of America. It is not the only one. China is another one. Why are they using so much antibiotics in animal medicine? What's the rationale? Well, one rationale that began early in the 50s is that it was shown that if you give even small amounts of antibiotics to animals, they grow faster. There is a growth enhancing component. The mechanism for that is partly hormonal and partly that when you give antibiotics, you kill bacteria in the gut. So what is the benefit to the producer? The benefit of adding antibiotics is that you can give them less food. So you can produce a bigger animal using less food. You see that? Now, the economics of that is debatable, but farmers believe that it is to their advantage to add antibiotics as a growth enhancer. Did you know that? Well, it's time to know it, because this has been going on. This is really, there is a lot going on in the press now about it. There is an article in the press just about every week. There was one in the New York Times just this week. So that's one reason. Now, how else are antibiotics used in non-human medicine? In human medicine, when you have a sick patient, you give antibiotics. If a person has pneumonia, you give antibiotics to that person, to the individual. When you have a sick animal in crowded conditions, how do you treat them then? How do you use antibiotics then? You treat the herd. You treat all of the animals. Nobody treats just one animal anymore. If the animal is really sick, you kill it. You don't cure it. So you have a completely different ecology of antibiotic use in non-human medicine. You have growth promotion, never do that with humans. You have treating the herd. And you have treatment in what is called subtherapeutic doses, which ecologically is much more problematic than treating in therapeutic doses. I can't get into that. I've tried to illustrate it here, that the quantitative footprint of antibiotic use in non-human medicine is huge, but the ecological footprint of antibiotic use in non-human medicine is much, much larger than the mere quantitative footprint. You see, did you have a question there?
So what happens when people eat this stuff?
What happens when
people eat animals that have been given so many antibiotics?
Well, something happens when they eat. What happens then, any kind of antibiotic use promotes development of resistance. You kill sensitive bacteria, you retain resistant bacteria. So any kind of antibiotic use it promotes resistance. So how is this shared around? Well, it is shared around by the fact that humans and non-humans, humans and animals, we all inhabit the same ecological space. So if you have enteric bacteria, if you have enterococci, say, that's an enteric bacterium, if you have that in a human being, you will find the same enterococcus in animals within a certain ecological space. So mostly these resistant components are transmitted by contact, factory workers. But it is also transmitted in foods, that you can't stop it. So all I'm saying is that one of the greatest contributors to the contemporary problem of antibiotic resistance is an ecological problem. It is a wholeness problem. It is failure to understand the components of wholeness that leads to, now thinking just in consequentialist terms, to the threat of very serious human illness that for which there is no effective antibiotics because we have recklessly used antibiotics in non-human medicine and treated animals, crowded them. We have to use antibiotics because we crowd them, so the disconnect there is the problem.
I was told that MRSA is exploding into different forms. MRSA.
Yes.
Is it because of the
methicillin-resistant staphylococci, which is one of the most serious problems in contemporary infectious disease, medicine, is very much part of this, because the evolution of methicillin, the first time one saw bacteria resistant to methicillin happened as enterococci. That's a bacteria that is quite innocuous. It lives in the gut. We have millions of them. You know that we have many more. We have millions and millions more bacteria in our gut than we have somatic cells. We are just sort of, swimming in bacteria, or bacteria certainly swimming in us. So, but your example is a good one. It is very much relevant to this topic and to the pressure on these bacteria. Is coming much from antibiotic use in non-human medicine. Industrialized methods of production are disease-producing. These methods involve extensive use of antibacterial substances. Humans and animals inhabit the same ecologic space. Powerful interests prevent transparency. You do not know how much antibiotics are used in non-human medicine in the US because the industry on all sides resist transparency. They do not want you to know. And our politicians are too weak to insist that you should know. It is hugely detrimental to human health in the long term, but short-term interest has prevailed. The metaphor here, I'm using the metaphor of Egypt and the promised land. God says, what does he say? The Lord displayed before our eyes great and awesome signs and wonders against Egypt, against Pharaoh and all his household. He brought us out from there in order to bring us in. Bring us out, bring us in. From that reality, and it has been developed nicely by Ellen Davis, who is an ecological reader of the Bible, that the Pharaoh idea was a centralized economy, centralized land ownership, predatory economics, slavery, all those things that are detrimental to humans, non-humans, and to the land. And then there is a transition. He brought us out from there in order to bring us in, and then laying out another kind of economy, an economy of freedom, an economy of respect for all creation, and an economy of wholeness. That's our concept here. To give us to the land he promised on oath to our ancestors. Then the Lord commanded us to observe all these statutes, to fear the Lord our God for our lasting good, so as to keep us alive, as is now the case. So this is it. So what we are seeing then, I'm just using this picture that you can see at the Getty Museum in Los Angeles, is that God is a caring God. There is, and this is, I use this mostly as a sort of terminology of the Sabbath, there is divine commitment over divine commandment in the ideology of the Old Testament and in the New. When we get Jesus and he comes in and he goes to the synagogue on the Sabbath in his hometown, and then they ask him to do the scripture reading. He gets to Isaiah, he unrolls the scroll and found the place where it was written, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because he has anointed me to bring good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim release to the captives and recovery of sight to the blind, to let the oppressed go free, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor." What is that? The year of the Lord's favor. Jubilee. Jubilee. Jubilee, which is a socio-economic reset with huge ecological implications, you see. So Jesus, does he abolish Jubilee ideology, or does he make it good on it? Does he deliver on it? He delivers on it, doesn't he? and he rolled up the scroll. This is an amazing day. I wish I'd been there. And he rolled up the scroll, gave it back to the attendant, and sat down. The eyes of all in the synagogue were fixed on him. Then he began to say to them, "Today this scripture has been fulfilled in your hearing." Is Jesus standing up for Jubilee ideology, for a notion of plenitude, for faithfulness to all creation? Very much so. Paul does the same thing. He writes in Romans. He is not well known for writing this, but here is a wonderful ecological text in the New Testament, maybe one of the strongest texts in all of the Bible. For the creation, Paul means non-human creation, waits with eager longing for the revealing of the children of God. For the creation, non-human creation, was subjected to futility. It lost its way. It didn't know what to do with itself, not of its own will, but of the will of the one who subjected it, in hope that the creation, non-human creation itself, will be set free from its bondage to decay and will obtain the freedom of the glory of the children of God. So, has God walked away from his commitment to non-human creation in the New Testament? Not on your life. Does he have expectations of human beings to help bring about, to sort of rectify what is wrong here? He does. Non-human creation waits with eager longing for the revealing of the children of God. I will close with two slides, one from the Bible and one from Wendell Berry. He visited an area of America in West Virginia where there is strip mining going on. That is the most ecologically reckless thing one can imagine. Since I left Hardburley, this is in the 60s, I have hardly been unable to escape the sense that I have been to the top of the mountain, and I have looked over and seen not the promised land vouchsafed to a chosen people, but a land of violence and sterility prepared and set aside for the damned. In Revelation, there is a notion of earth healing and earth renewed. Then I saw a new heaven and a new earth, for the first heaven and the first earth had passed away, and the sea was no more. This is not a replacement earth. This is a healed earth, a renewed earth. That's how to exegete, how to do exegesis on this passage. It is not replacement. Well, that earth, discard it. God made a commitment to humans, to non-humans, and to the earth. And the way God makes good on that commitment is not to replace you with another human being, or you with another human being, but to make good, to really to heal and make us right, for us. He makes a similar commitment to the earth and to non-humans in a certain way. And then there is the notion, as earth is being healed and renewed, earth is also bringing healing. There is reciprocity, the language of healing in the New Testament. On either side of the river is the tree of life with its 12 kinds of fruit, producing its fruit each month, and the leaves of the tree are for the healing of the nations. How about that? No configuration of wholeness can bypass ecology and claim wholeness as its mantle. I hope we have seen that. Ecological configurations think in terms of plenitude, not only production or economic prosperity. The eco-theology of wholeness proclaims God's faithfulness to all creation. If the problem in our world is that to some extent can be described in terms of a dualist anthropology, an ideology of domination that began with Francis Bacon. I didn't say much about Francis Bacon, I forgot, but Francis Bacon is a 17th century philosopher who has many good ideas. There is an enthusiasm in Bacon for interest, taking interest in the earth. But there is also in Bacon the sort of the seeds of a thought of domination, of conquest. I should have said more about it, but we said enough as it was, and that's basically the gist of it. The ideology of domination that you have, that we must in some ways blame at least a little bit on Bacon. There is eclipse of creation theology, and there is an emphasis on production. What is the remedy? The remedy is a holist anthropology. The remedy is an ideology that looks at the earth in terms of, with an attitude to protect and preserve, not dominate. There is not eclipse of creation, there is celebration of creation. There is a notion of plenitude versus production. So production thinks, in materialistic terms. Plenitude thinks in terms of what? The good of everybody. You cannot flourish in one area if the whole does not flourish. So plenitude is a sort of cipher for wholeness here. And then, of course, in the biblical paradigm, there is hope. There is hope because God is going to make good on His commitment, God's commitment to all creation. So those are some of the elements in an ecological configuration of wholeness.
Thank you so much. There's on the earliest slide you mentioned the Sabbath as a satellite.
I mentioned.
Why did you use that?
No, I talked about Sabbath satellites. You have the home base of the Sabbath. That's the seventh-day Sabbath. That's home base. You have Sabbath outposts, satellites of the Sabbath, outgrowths of the Sabbath. The sabbatical year and the Jubilee, they are elements of a sort of trinity, three Sabbath elements in the Old Testament. The Sabbath is the core. The sabbatical year, the Jubilee are outposts or satellites of the home base that is the Sabbath. But they do show us that there are ecological and economic, ecological and economic elements belong to the ideology of the Sabbath. They are accentuated in the sabbatical year and in the Jubilee. And some of that has not been regarded or has not been preserved in much of contemporary Sabbath theology. So, okay, thank you.